2024, an election year like no other. From the candidates to the issues, from voter integrity and analysis, we'll discuss debates, trends, patterns, election laws, and more. This is Vote 2024, Path to the Polls.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion. DEI efforts in America seem to be losing momentum. And if you look at the corporate landscape in certain consulting reports, it may be in great part to the Supreme Court's affirmative action ruling. The High Court struck down affirmative action in colleges, ruling they can't explicitly consider race in the college admission process. And now external forces don't seem to be pushing companies to invest in DEI. In fact, quite the opposite. In some cases, they seem to be pushing back. Welcome to Vote 2024, Path to the Polls. I'm Bruce Hamilton. To explore the issue and to find out what's happening, why it's spilling over into corporate America, once again here on Path to the Polls, constitutional law expert Rod Sullivan. Good morning. Welcome back to the program. Appreciate you having here. To find out why, we have to turn back the clock a bit to 2020 and see how the door to DEI was opened. And it has its roots in the George Floyd murder case.
Yeah, it is. It did. After the George Floyd murder, there was a tremendous increase, a 92% increase in job openings for DEI positions in companies throughout the United States. And a lot of those positions were filled, and all of a sudden, DEI, which had been on a growth path for many years, suddenly exploded. And every S&P 500 company seemed to be adding a DEI department. Governments were adding DEI departments, and the process continued to grow.
So then the tide turned a bit in June of last year with the Supreme Court's ruling on affirmative action on college admissions at Harvard and UNC. What was the court's stance and its justification?
Well, there were two lawsuits. They were both brought by the Students for Fair Admissions, which was a consortium of Asian and white students suing Harvard and UNC, saying that these organizations were explicitly discriminating against persons of Asian descent and white descent in favor of African American and other minority candidates. The Supreme Court had approved the inclusion or consideration of race in two cases. You might remember 25 years ago, the Bakke case in California, and then there was a case called Grutter versus Bollinger. And both of those cases said, we're going to permit there to be a consideration of race at admissions at these colleges. But a phrase in that last opinion that is totally ignored is Justice O'Connor said, but we're only going to allow this for 25 years. We don't expect this to continue to go on past 25 years. So 23 years later, these two cases came before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court came down. And it wasn't as much the decision itself as it was the dicta in the decision. Phrases like, the only way to eliminate racism is to eliminate racism everywhere. There is no way to gauge whether or not this 25-year window has caused there to be more African American or minority leaders. It's no way to measure whether or not it's improved any kind of performance. Therefore, we find there's no longer a compelling governmental interest for colleges to engage in affirmative action or racial discrimination in admissions, and therefore those processes need to come to an end. And I don't think people realize how open affirmative action was at these colleges. Harvard, take as an example, they had a number of cuts in the system, and when they finally got down to the final cut, it was called the lop, and they would lop off a bunch of candidates who are otherwise qualified and say, okay, you're not coming and you are. And the primary factor used in deciding, there were four factors, okay? But let's be honest. I mean, there was legacy, there was athletic achievement, there was ability for financial age, but the determinative factor in most of those people who were lopped off was their race. If you were white, male, you got lopped off. If you were African American, female, lesbian, gay, so on and so forth, you were lopped in. Well, it was a very blunt tool. And Congress and the courts have long said that quotas are invidious discrimination, and we're not going to allow that anymore. And because Harvard engaged in this, and then in the discovery process, it really came out, the Supreme Court said, no, that's it, no more. Now, The effect on UNC and Harvard, and by the way, I also ought to indicate there was an escape clause put in called the Roberts escape clause. And that was, well, you can ask an essay question. And in that essay question, you can ask a student to describe the obstacles they've had to overcome in getting where they are today and applying to either Harvard and UNC. And of course, everybody who writes an essay starts out as an African-American student, as a Hispanic student, as a Muslim, whatever it may be. I had these obstacles to overcome. And of course, that has become sort of a backdoor way of getting around.
A circuitous way.
A circuitous way, yeah. And you know, people are getting counseled. You know, you can hire a college admission counselor who will tell you, you want to get into this school, this is what you need to put in your essay. So the essay has been the Roberts workaround. But the effect that you're not seeing yet, but I'm seeing because I look at the cases that are being filed and how the decisions are coming out in the lower courts that'll be up to the Supreme Court in the next few years, has been a groundswell. And there have been a groundswell of opinions that have been filed against affirmative action and DEI programs that are predominantly, so far, as an example, being successful. Let me talk about one in particular. There's an English professor at the University of Pennsylvania. His name is Zach DiPiero. Been there for 20 plus years. After the George Floyd murder, the DEI office sent out a letter to every single person saying, you know, you need to be ashamed of being white. You need to understand the role that your whiteness played in the death of George Floyd, and therefore you need to account for that in your pedagogy and your teaching. Well, that did not sit well with Professor DiPiero, and he complained, and they sent him to diversity training. And so he went to diversity training, and they said, everybody in this class, we want you to hold your breath. But if you're white, you need to hold your breath longer than everybody else to atone for what white people have done to minority people of color and the like. And these are just two minor incidents. You know, his complaint goes on and lists a whole plethora of ways in which he felt like he was being singled out as a white professor. Perhaps the most egregious was he was asked to change his grading methods. He was teaching writing, and he had a race-neutral way of grading, and African Americans were showing up in the lower portion of the grade curve. And so they said, you need to change that. You need to change the way you administer tests and grade so that African Americans will appear higher in the curve than they were under this system you've been using for the last 20 years. Well, he eventually said, and by the way, this continued to build in heat, and eventually they came into his classroom during class, escorted him out to the dean's office, and the dean said, you need to resign. And he resigned, and they thought about it for a while, and he said, no, I'm going to file a lawsuit. Now, typically, that type of lawsuit, a white professor suing because they felt discriminated against because of their race, wouldn't even be a civil rights case. This time, after the UNC-Harvard decision came out, the court said, no, that states a cause of action. We're going to let this case go forward. And so that case now is percolating its way through the courts. Will it go to a trial? I don't know. If I was UPenn, under his set of facts, I think that's a case you want to settle. But that's not the only one. You can come down here to Florida, Daytona. There's a group that runs a scholarship program that is specifically limited to African-American female entrepreneurs. Gives them $20,000, they apply, and whites are not permitted to apply. Somebody filed suit against them, and it went to the district court, and the district court said, no, we're not going to issue a preliminary injunction, we're going to let the case go forward. And they appealed it to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta, and the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals said, no, this plaintiff, who's not allowed to participate in this grant program, has a high likelihood of succeeding on the merits, and therefore we're going to put in place a preliminary injunction. No scholarship shall be awarded until this case has been resolved. So that's just sort of another example of what we see happening, and I think I would trace that back to the Supreme Court's decision.
So this country, in trying to find some sort of a fair ground, some sort of a middle ground, always finds the door swinging too far one way left, too far one way right, because terms like affirmative action or DEI become politicized and weaponized.
Mm-hmm. You know, there are two views of how we should handle diversity in this country. There's the melting pot view, which is that we should all come together and become Americans. And then there's the tossed salad view, which is that we should all be separate identities, whether it's racial, sexual, gender identities, and that we all get thrown together in this tossed salad. And so the country struggles with whether we're a melting pot or whether we're a tossed salad. And for the last 25 years, the bias has been toward the salad, tossed salad approach. Everybody has their own identity. We want as many identities as possible, and we're not going to have a melting pot. And so by turning the tables on one group, do you create fairness to the other? In other words, the question might be, are two wrongs made them right? White, slip there. If in the 1960s there was discrimination and violence against African Americans in the South, do we then correct that by allowing there to be discrimination against whites in the South today? I think we saw this debate when we looked at the city of Jacksonville appointing a chief of diversity and inclusion. The city council initially said, we're not going to fund it. Mayor Deegan said, no, I'm going to take $232,000 from other portions of my budget. I'm going to create it, and we're going to create this chief of diversity and inclusion. But we're sort of bringing ourselves as the city of Jacksonville firmly into the tossed salad approach, and definitely against the melting pot approach.
But it's interesting to note because the Supreme Court ruling had no legal impact on workplace law, but there has been fallout, big time fallout in corporate America.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And corporate America, I'm glad you brought corporate America into this, because all the Supreme Court decision did is affect universities. But it's clear now that governments are in the same position. Governments cannot employ affirmative action or DEI in a way that is adverse to whites, males, Asians, and the like. But corporate America is very much in the DEI camp. And of the S&P 500 companies, I think it's roughly 60% of them have DEI departments. And the question is, how is this going to affect private companies in the United States? And one of the most interesting things was this idea that there are studies out there. And the S&P 500 companies, the big companies, have all bought into these studies. Primarily, the McKinsey company produced a study that said, well, corporations which engage in diversity, inclusion, and equity do better financially. So you'll make more money if you hire based upon race, you promote based upon sex, gender, and whatever. And therefore, this is your rationale. You're not doing it because you're trying to be fair. You're trying to do it because you will make more money. One of the primary, amicus briefs before the Supreme Court tend to be plain vanilla, but a couple of the amicus briefs came up and said these studies, the McKinsey company study, the Harvard Business Review study, this is junk science. There is no scientific basis for what they say. They were produced to produce a certain outcome, and the outcome, the preordained outcome, was that DEI was good for profits and good for the bottom line. And the couple of the Supreme Court justices picked up on that in the oral argument, and you heard them. The advocates for Harvard and UNC would come forward and say, yeah, but this is actually good business. This is good for us as Americans. And a couple of justices said, are these studies really authentic? Are they really accurate? Who wrote them? And if you look at the biggest one, the McKinsey, which is one of the three largest management consulting companies in the world, the McKinsey report that said diversity matters was written by an African American or an African English woman who was in charge of the Black Equity organization. So was it an unbiased study to begin with? And people started questioning these studies. And it's become almost rote in corporate America. Diversity is good for the business. It's good for the bottom line. You need to do it not because it's the right thing to do, but you need to do it because it'll increase your profits. And the justices were questioning that, and a lot of academics are questioning that too. So, brings us to the next question. Are corporation DEI departments at risk? And I think the fact is they may be, because their employees are going to be able to start to sue under the Civil Rights Act, alleging that they were discriminated against by the affirmative action program, or they were discriminated against because of the training programs they had to go through. If you have had to go to an emotional intelligence program, in that program, have you been told that corporate America is systematically racist and anti-women, and that you as a white man or you as a, have to be guilty. You hold guilt simply by virtue of being born of white parents. You bear a guilt for the other races not doing quite as well. And then finally, maybe not finally, but we are also carrying this over into the question of specific jobs. For instance, United Airlines. United Airlines CEO came to the Halloween party last year dressed as a female pilot to show his desire to recruit more female pilots. And then Morgan Stanley got together with United Airlines and said, we're going to go ahead and train 2,500 female pilots and African-American pilots and minority pilots to fill our ranks of pilots in the future. We've got a school that we train pilots at, and half of that school is going to be devoted to diversity hires. Rob Snyder, who's a stand-up comedian, turned that into a whole stand-up routine. He said, you mean you're not going to hire the best pilots? You're going to hire female and African-American pilots and put them in charge of airplanes? And he goes on and gets a lot of laughs at it.
He got laughs, but he got a lot of flack too.
He got a lot of flack, absolutely. You know, we have this cancel culture. You tell the wrong jokes, you're on the wrong side of the cancel culture, and that happens. And then we have another lawsuit brought by a guy named Brigada as the head of a class action against Pete Buttigieg, dealing with air traffic controllers. The air traffic control system had a collegiate training institute where people who went to college and studied to be an air traffic controller would therefore have a better pipeline into becoming an air traffic controller. Pete Buttigieg did away with it. He said, no, from now on we're going to have a general pool, and people who have graduated from the CTI program are no longer going to receive any kind of preference. And his alleged reason was because we want too many white males are taking the class, are getting trained as air traffic controllers, not enough African Americans and females are, and we want to change that ratio. Then they started doing these screening tests, and the FAA admitted, this is really odd, they gave people who took the screening test a cheat sheet as to what you needed to put as answers on your biographical sketch that would increase your chances of becoming an air traffic controller. One of the oddest ones, and the FAA admitted this, was if you said, my worst subject in high school was science, you went up. Your chances of becoming an air traffic controller went up if you were bad in science and bad in math.
Sounds counterintuitive.
Oh, it really does, which is why, of course, that one particular answer gained so much attention in the FAA selection process. So that case is still making its way through the courts, but it has so far survived a motion to dismiss, and it's proceeding with discovery, and I anticipate that that's going to be another program that's going to be looked at carefully. Do we want to select air traffic controllers and airline pilots based upon factors other than their ability to pilot an aircraft or prevent close call situations on the ground?
So some people ask, simply, why can't they hire the most qualified? Does ageism factor into all of this? And is the backlash going to continue to rise? We'll answer those questions when we come back on Path to the Polls. Welcome back to Path to the Polls. Bruce Hamilton, along with constitutional law expert Rod Sullivan. We're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, the Supreme Court ruling that applied to college admissions programs spilling over into corporate America. And before the break, we were talking about the fact that people are asking, why can't corporate America simply go ahead and say, well, we want to look at the most qualified people without regard to anything else? Why?
Well, I think that's what the Supreme Court wants. The Supreme Court says we want a colorblind society. Martin Luther King, his great speech was, I want a society where race doesn't matter. And he was a follower of Mahatma Gandhi, whose position was that race, religion, and sex should not matter. But we've gone 25 years down this road where affirmative action is an approved legal technique. Corporate America has adopted it. The major business schools and the major universities have adopted it, and they are the experts to which corporate America is listening. So it's going to be a long time to turn around corporate America. I mean, the government is actually turning more quickly on this issue than corporate America is.
Ageism falls into this bracket as well.
Yeah.
Ageism often translates into experience. Ageism plays a factor because corporate America is very bottom lined and they don't want to pay for experience. Mm-hmm. Yet you have a culture right now where corporate America is confronted with a bunch of people who have a lack of work ethic and don't want to even come and show up on the job, yet they placate those workers. It's a conundrum.
If you look at the recent appointments to boards of directors of major corporations in the United States, the age is constantly coming down. And they say it's not a quota system, but I mean, if you look at these organizations, it is. If you look at the Disney board of directors, there are exactly 5 women and exactly 5 men. And there's exactly 1 African American to sort of approach the 11 to 14% African American population. I mean, they have used a quota in assembling their board. And this has resulted in more senior executives getting forced out. And then, of course, they had to bring Bob Iger, the most senior Disney employee who's been there 47 years. They had to bring him back because the CEO got into the dispute with the state of Florida. And, that affected their bottom line. So, yes, it does affect, ageism does affect all of these decisions. You are forcing out a group of people who have worked their way up through the industry and now find themselves at the top and are being displaced by other people based upon factors other than simply qualifications or ability. And that's a factor of American life. Did the Kinsey report ever take that into account when it said that increasing diversity would increase profits? I doubt it. I doubt they even thought about it. But it is a factor of American life.
Do you expect the backlash to continue to rise or perhaps even worsen?
No, I do. I think this is going to be a bottom-up sort of revolution. The people who are bringing these lawsuits, challenging affirmative action, are more ordinary Joes. Nobody would have heard of Zach DiPiero if he hadn't gotten forced out of his job after 25 years at the University of Pennsylvania because he complained about affirmative action. Mr. Brigada, who's bringing this suit against Mr. Buttigieg for air traffic controllers, he was just a guy who went and got his air traffic controller degree from a college, and they said, nope, sorry, that program is no longer in. You're no longer going to be able to be an air traffic controller. And he heads up a class action of people who are all in this same situation. So this is a bottom-up revolution, and I think it's going to take a long time for corporate America to turn around.
Is the backlash you're talking about rising because DEI had a real impact, positive or negative?
I think that DEI rubbed people the wrong way. If you look at Jacksonville's situation in particular, I mean, Mayor Deegan comes in, she says, I want to create a chief of diversity and inclusion, and I want Dr. Parved from UNF, who actually headed up at the business school, their diversity department, I want him to head up the city's diversity department. And the city council said, no, we're not going to allot money for that. And there was a lot of back and forth. Donna Deegan even took swipes at Governor DeSantis. He said, well, DeSantis is no friend of DEI, and that's why the Jacksonville City Council won't approve this money for the DEI. Anyway, she went ahead and found the money. She created the position, and Dr. Ahmed Parvez got in the position. He's now our chief of diversity inclusion. But if you listen to what he is saying, he's actually making the exact same mistakes that Harvard and University of North Carolina and the FAA and the scholarship people have all made. And he said, I'm going to see that there's diversity in grants, in contracting, in hiring, and promotion. Those are the things that really, when somebody loses a promotion or doesn't get a job because of DEI, they become plaintiffs. And I think if the DEI office follows through on that, they're going to have lawsuits, and these lawsuits are going to flesh out this issue in the city of Jacksonville. One of the other things he said he's going to do is he's going to make sure that all the boards and committees that the city of Jacksonville have are staffed with minorities. And then he says I'm going to reach out to diverse communities, and I'm going to bring them in so they'll vote in local elections. Well, then you've got a political overtone there. You know, I'm going to become the vote getter in chief for Donna Deegan in the next election by bringing these diverse people to the polls, souls to the polls. I'm going to be in charge of doing that. So they're really setting, in my opinion, the city of Jacksonville is setting itself up for a contentious period with lots of lawsuits.
Does this nation, does corporate America ever really learn its lesson, or does it just, swing one way and swing the other and never find that middle ground?
Yeah, well, it doesn't. The very word diversity comes from two Latin words, which diverse, which is to blow people apart or burst people apart, and verse, change of direction. And so we're complaining about the fact that the United States is more divided than ever, which again contains that word div, burst apart, and yet we have more and more diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Well, there is no equity.
Yeah, well, equity has sort of gone a little bit out of the title. But the question is, people are saying, well, we need more DEI because we're so diverse in our political views. And there are people who are saying maybe the reason that we have such division in this country is because no longer is race not a factor. Race is the most important factor. Race is what we talk about all the time. Race is the very first consideration that comes into your mind when you're thinking about, I want to apply to an elite college, I want to get an elite job, I want to be promoted. It's always a question of race, and maybe that's why we're so divided as a nation.
Fundamental question, last question, bottom line question. When all's said and done, according to the law and even the Supreme Court ruling, based maybe just for college admissions, but certainly applicable in corporate America's mind, is DEI hiring illegal?
I think that the eventual answer to that question is going to be yes. If you are considering race, sex, and gender in your hiring decisions, you are violating the Civil Rights Act. And I want to tell you one other thing about that scholarship program that was only for African American women. One of the three judges on the 11th Circuit dissented. And his dissent was, white people don't have a civil right under the Civil Rights Act to file a lawsuit. Now, to a lot of people, that's a pretty shocking idea, the idea that we have a Civil Rights Act that gives you the right to bring a lawsuit if you're discriminated against on the basis of race. But according to this one judge, white people don't have that right. And I think that that's an old way of thinking, and that way of thinking is going away. The Supreme Court is going to consider two civil rights cases on EEOC and hiring based upon race this term. And I think they're going to further massage this idea that civil rights, that everybody has civil rights. White, black, Asian, women, and men all have civil rights, and they all have the right to bring a suit. So are we eventually going to get it right? Yes, but I think we're for a period of time, and particularly in corporate America, to turn this ship around, to get to the point where we're truly one society and we no longer consider race to be the most important thing.
Will we live to see it?
Oh, I hope to live a long time, so yes.
Good, we're ending on a positive note.
Yes.
Rod Sullivan, always a pleasure.
Bruce, enjoyed it.
Appreciate you watching us on Path to the Polls. If you'd like to weigh in, you can certainly feel free to email me. Keep it on an even keel, bhamilton@wjxt.com. Watch Path to the Polls on your own time, your own schedule, on demand on News4JAX Plus, the News4Jax YouTube channel, and news4jax.com. Have a great day.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.